The Valorian cargo vessel Quiet Horizon was dying a slow and painful death in the cold darkness of space. Captain Zeleth stood at the center of the bridge and watched the emergency lights flicker in patterns that told a story of system failures spreading through his beloved ship like a disease. The air recyclers were struggling to keep up with the demand. The engines were completely dead, reduced to twisted metal and sparking wires by the attack that had crippled them. The shields had collapsed 20 minutes ago, and now the only thing keeping the crew alive was the thin metal hull that separated them from the endless emptiness that surrounded them on all sides. Zeleth was a Valorian, a species known across the galaxy for their patient nature and their remarkable skill in matters of trade and commerce. His scales shimmered with pale blue light when he was calm and content, but now they had turned a dull and lifeless gray. Fear did that to his kind. Fear and the terrible knowledge that death was circling closer with every passing moment. Like a predator waiting to strike, the Kreth had come out of nowhere. 3 raider ships had dropped out of hyperspace right on top of the convoy without any warning at all. And within seconds, the escort vessels that were supposed to protect them had become burning wreckage drifting through the void. The Quiet Horizon had tried to run, pushing her engines beyond their safe limits in a desperate attempt to escape. But a lucky shot from the lead raider had torn through the engine compartment and left them drifting helplessly. Now the ship floated in the outer reaches of the Indera Nebula, surrounded by the purple and gold clouds of gas that made this region so beautiful to look at, and so incredibly dangerous to travel through. Zeleth turned to look at his crew. There were 47 souls on board his ship, including 12 younglings who had been traveling with their families to a new colony world where they hoped to build better lives. He could see the terror in their eyes as they looked back at him, waiting for him to tell them that everything would be all right. They all knew what the Kreth did to their prisoners. The slave markets of the outer territories were filled with species who had been unlucky enough to cross paths with these brutal raiders. The Kreth did not kill their victims quickly. They broke them down piece by piece and sold them to the highest bidder, scattering families across the galaxy never to see each other again. Chief. Communications Officer Taryn worked frantically at her station in the corner of the bridge. She was young for her position, barely past her second molting cycle. But she was clever and determined and refused to give up even when the situation seemed impossible. Her claws moved across the damaged console with desperate speed as she tried to bring the communications array back online. Most of the primary systems had been destroyed in the attack, but she had remembered an old backup transmitter buried deep in the lower decks of the ship. It was outdated technology that had not been used in years, and it was weak compared to modern equipment. But it might be enough to send a signal beyond the nebula. Captain Zeleth moved across the bridge to stand beside her. He asked if she could get a signal out to anyone who might be listening, and Taryn replied that she believed she could. But the range would be very limited because of the damage to the ship and the interference from the nebula itself. The signal would barely reach the edge of the nebula before it faded into nothing. She was not certain that anyone would hear it at all. Zeleth placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and told her to send it anyway. They had no other options left to them. It was this or nothing. Twain activated the emergency beacon and transmitted, on all available frequencies that the old system could reach. The distress call went out into the void like a bottle thrown into a vast and uncaring ocean, and carrying with it the coordinates of the Quiet Horizon and a simple message that she hoped someone would receive. They were under attack. They were damaged and helpless. They needed help immediately. Please respond if you can hear us, according to the protocols established by the Galactic Union. The nearest patrol fleet that could respond to such emergencies was stationed in the Helix system. That was 14 standard hours away, even at maximum speed. Zeleth did the calculations in his head and felt both of his hearts sink deep into his chest. The Kreth raiders were already turning back toward them, having finished looting the destroyed escort ships. They were coming to collect their real prize. They would be here in less than an hour. 14 hours was a lifetime away. They would not survive 14 minutes once the Kreth began their boarding action and started dragging crew members off the ship, and Chain Zeleth looked out through the main viewport at the 3 raider ships visible in the distance. They were ugly vessels, built for nothing but speed and violence and cruelty. Their hulls were painted with the crude symbols of their clan. markings that promised suffering and pain to anyone unfortunate enough to fall into their hands. He had heard stories about what happened on those ships during the long journeys to the slave markets. He had heard about the screams that echoed through metal corridors. He prayed silently that his crew would never have to learn. Whether those terrible stories were true, on the other side of the nebula, far from the drama unfolding around the quiet horizon, the distress signal traveled through the swirling clouds of gas and dust. It passed through regions of space where no sentient being had traveled in centuries. It bounced off ancient asteroid fields and slipped through gaps in the electromagnetic interference caused by the nebula's powerful magnetic storms. And then, against all reasonable odds, it reached the sensors of a small human outpost positioned on the very edge of explored space. Outpost 7 was not an impressive installation by any standard. It was little more than a collection of prefabricated modules bolted together and anchored to a barren rock, floating in the darkness between stars. The humans who staffed it were part of a survey team assigned to map the nebula and catalog its resources for future exploration and possible colonization. They were scientists and engineers and technicians, not soldiers or warriors. But they had communication equipment powerful enough to reach across vast distances. And they had standing orders to monitor all emergency frequencies at all times. Lieutenant Jake Morrison was on duty when the signal came through the static. He was 26 years old, with short brown hair and tired eyes that came from spending many nights staring at sensor screens waiting for something interesting to happen. He had joined the Survey Corps because he wanted to see the wonders of the galaxy. But so far, all he had seen was this tiny outpost and the endless swirl of the nebula visible through his small window. When the distress call appeared on his console, Jake sat up straight in his chair and listened carefully to the garbled transmission. The message was heavily distorted by interference from the nebula, but the meaning behind it was absolutely clear. Someone was in serious trouble. Someone was asking for help before it was too late. Jake checked the coordinates included in the signal, felt his stomach tighten with concern. The signal was coming from deep inside the nebula, far from any territory that humans were authorized to enter. According to the official galactic maps, that region was technically under the jurisdiction of the Galactic Union. Humans were not supposed to operate there without explicit permission from the Council. They were still considered a junior species. New arrivals to the galactic community who had not yet earned the trust that came with full membership, but Jake also knew that the nearest Union patrol was many hours away. He had intercepted enough official communications to understand how slowly the bureaucracy of the Union actually moved when it came to taking action. By the time anyone with proper authorization responded to this desperate call, whoever had sent it would almost certainly be dead or suffering a fate. Even worse than death, he made a decision that would change everything. He pulled up the communication logs and searched for the position of the nearest human vessel capable of responding. It was a carrier group led by a ship called the USS Resolute, currently conducting patrol operations along the frontier. They were close. They were very close indeed. Jake transmitted the distress signal to the Resolute along with all the tactical data he could gather from the fragmentary transmission. He added a personal note at the end explaining the desperate situation and the severe time constraints involved. Then he sat back in his chair and waited, anxiously for a response. He did not have to wait long at all. On board the quiet horizon, Captain Zeleth watched through the viewport as the Kreth Raiders began their final approach toward his helpless ship. He gathered his crew together in the center of the bridge and told them to prepare themselves for the worst that was about to come. He told the families to hide their younglings in the deepest cargo holds of the ship, where they might escape notice for at least a little while. He told his officers to arm themselves with whatever tools and implements they could find in the maintenance lockers. They would not surrender quietly. They would fight with everything they had. But in his heart, Zeleth knew that it was completely hopeless. No one was coming to save them. No one would arrive in time to make any difference at all. He was wrong. The USS Resolute was a warship built for one single purpose, and that purpose was war. She was not elegant like the graceful vessels designed by the elder races of the galaxy. She was not beautiful or refined or created to impress diplomats and politicians at fancy orbital stations. She was a carrier, floating fortress wrapped in layers of thick armor plating and bristling with weapon systems that could tear through enemy ships like a hot blade through soft butter. Her hull was painted in the dark gray colors that identified vessels of the human fleet, and her name was written on her side in bold white letters that promised unwavering strength to allies and complete destruction to anyone foolish enough to become her. Enemy Captain Lisa Garrett stood on the bridge of this mighty vessel and carefully read the distress signal that had just arrived from the distant outpost. 7. She was a woman in her early 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and short black hair that was streaked with gray at the temples from years of stress and responsibility. She had served in the fleet for over 20 years and had seen enough combat during that time to understand that hesitation always costs lives. Her uniform was crisp and perfectly clean as regulations demanded, but there were old scars visible on her hands that told silent stories of battles fought and won in the dark and dangerous spaces between the stars. Commander Sam Tanner stood beside her at the Central Command Station, carefully reviewing the tactical data displayed on his personal screen. He was her executive officer, a tall man with a calm and measured voice and a brilliant mind that was perfectly suited for strategic thinking. He pulled up the sensor readings that had been transmitted along with the distress call and displayed them on the main view screen, so that the entire bridge crew could see exactly what they were dealing with. The image showed the Andara Nebula in all its dangerous beauty, a massive swirling cloud of purple and gold gases that stretched across many light years of space. Deep inside that glowing nebula, a small green dot marked the position of a damaged alien vessel in desperate need of assistance. 3 red dots were closing in on that green marker from the north, moving steadily closer like wolves approaching wounded prey. Tanner explained the situation to the captain in his steady, professional voice. The vessel sending the distress signal was Valorian, a cargo ship registered under the name Quiet Horizon. It had been ambushed and attacked by Kreth raiders and was now completely dead in space, with no power and no way to escape. The crew was broadcasting a distress call on all available frequencies begging for help. But the nearest Galactic Union patrol fleet was stationed 14 standard hours away at best possible speed. The Kreth Raider ships would reach the helpless vessel in approximately 40 minutes, Captain. Garrett studied the tactical display for a long and thoughtful moment before speaking. She asked about the crew complement of the Valorian cargo ship, and Tanner checked the official records stored in the ship's database. He reported that cargo vessels of that particular class typically carried between 40 and 60 individuals on board, often including families with younglings who were traveling to distant colony worlds to start new lives. The bridge fell completely silent as the weight of those words settled over everyone present. All of the officers understood exactly what that information meant. Families were on that ship. Children were on that ship. Innocent and helpless people were waiting in fear and darkness to be taken by brutal slavers who would tear them apart from each other and sell them across the galaxy to masters who would treat them as property rather than living beings. Ensign Danny Park sat at the helm station with his hands resting lightly on the navigation controls. He was young, barely 22 years old, with a round, honest face and a nervous energy that made him fidget and shift in his seat whenever things were too quiet around him. But he was also one of the most naturally gifted pilots serving anywhere in the entire fleet, blessed with lightning reflexes that could thread a ship through a dense asteroid field at high speed without scratching the paint. He looked up at the captain with eager anticipation and waited for her orders. Commander Tanner cleared his throat and reminded Captain Garrett of the complicated diplomatic situation that surrounded this decision. Humans were not officially authorized to operate anywhere in Union space without explicit permission from the Galactic Council. The Andara Nebula was technically located within territory that fell under Union jurisdiction, according to all recognized treaties. If the Resolute entered that region uninvited and engaged hostile forces in combat, there would certainly be serious political consequences to face afterward. The Galactic Council had already expressed significant concerns about what they called human military expansion into areas where they had not been invited. This kind of unauthorized action could give the Council exactly the excuse they had been looking for, to impose harsh restrictions on human fleet movements throughout the frontier regions. Captain Garrett listened patiently to all of these valid concerns without allowing any expression to cross her face. When Tanner finished speaking his piece, she turned to look at him directly and asked him one very simple question. She asked how long it would actually take for the Resolute and her escort vessels to reach the damaged Valorian ship if they left immediately at maximum speed. Tanner ran the calculations quickly on his console. He reported that at maximum sustainable speed, they could arrive at the coordinates in 38 minutes. Garrett nodded slowly as she processed that information. That was just 2 minutes before the Kreth Raiders would reach the quiet horizon. It would be extremely close, cutting the timing down to almost nothing. But it was definitely possible if they moved immediately without any further delay. She stood up from her command chair and turned to face her entire bridge crew. She looked at each of them in turn, meeting their eyes and seeing the uncertainty written on some faces and fierce determination burning in others. Then she announced her decision in a voice that carried absolute authority and left no room for argument or debate. She ordered Ensign Park to set a direct course for the quiet horizon at maximum speed without any deviation. She ordered the weapons officer to begin charging all main batteries and preparing all weapons systems for immediate combat operations. She ordered the communications officer to signal their escort frigates, the Valiant and the Defiance, to form up an attack formation and prepare for possible engagement with hostile forces. Commander Tanner stepped closer to her and lowered his voice, so that only she could hear what he said next. He asked her if she was absolutely certain about this course of action. He reminded her that this decision could very well end her career if the Council decided to make an example of her. It could damage the already fragile relationship between humanity and the Galactic Union for many years to come. Captain? Garrett turned her head to look at him with eyes that held no doubt whatsoever about what needed to be done. She told him that somewhere out there in the darkness of that nebula, families were huddled together, waiting to be taken by monsters who would destroy everything they loved. Children were crying in the dark corners of that ship, while their parents tried desperately to comfort them with reassuring lies about rescue ships that they believed would never actually come. And she, Lisa Garrett, was close enough to do something real about that terrible situation. She asked Tanner a question of her own in return. She asked him what kind of people they would truly be if they turned their ships around and flew away in the opposite direction, leaving those families to suffer and die, simply because they were worried about paperwork and diplomatic complications and political inconvenience. Tanner held her steady gaze for a long moment as he considered her words. Then he simply nodded once in understanding and acceptance and turned back to his station without another word of protest. He began immediately coordinating the tactical approach with the captains of the escort frigates through secure communication channels. The Resolute surged forward with tremendous power as her massive engines roared to full life. The entire ship shuddered and vibrated with barely contained energy as she accelerated rapidly toward the distant nebula, leaving behind the relative safety of human territory and plunging boldly into the unknown dangers that waited ahead. Running alongside her like faithful hunting hounds accompanying a great wolf, the smaller and faster frigates, Valiant and Defiance, matched her course and speed with precision. Commander? Megan Cole commanded the Valiant from her own compact bridge. She was a fierce and aggressive woman with bright red hair tied back in a tight, practical bun and a well-earned reputation for bold tactics that had brought her both official commendations and official reprimands in roughly equal measure throughout her eventful career. When she received the battle orders transmitted from the Resolute, she allowed herself a small, satisfied smile and told her eager crew to prepare themselves for a proper fight. On the bridge of the Defiance, Captain Henry Walsh ran carefully through his pre-battle checklist with the methodical precision that had always defined his steady command style. He was older than the other captains in this small task force, a grizzled veteran of the border conflicts that had helped shape human expansion into the wider galaxy over the past decades. He had personally witnessed what raiders like the Kreth did to their helpless victims when no one arrived in time to stop them. He had absolutely no intention of allowing that kind of horror to happen ever again if he could possibly prevent it. The 3 human warships entered the swirling outer edges of the Indera Nebula and quickly disappeared into the glowing clouds of gas and cosmic dust. Their advanced sensors struggled against the heavy electromagnetic interference generated by the nebula. But they pushed forward regardless of the difficulty. They had exact coordinates programmed into their navigation systems, and they had a clear mission burned into their hearts. Nothing else mattered except reaching those people in time, Captain. Garrett watched the countdown timer on the main view screen as the minutes slowly ticked away. She thought about the frightened people on that distant, damaged ship, waiting hopelessly for help that they truly believed would never arrive in time to save them. She thought about the Kreth raiders closing in with eager cruelty. Ready to claim their valuable prizes, she allowed herself a small, grim smile. As she contemplated how very surprised everyone was about to be, the Kreth raiders had done this many times before. They were experienced hunters who had perfected their cruel craft over countless raids across the frontier territories. They knew exactly how to disable a ship without destroying it completely. They knew how to approach a helpless target with maximum intimidation to break the spirit of the crew before the boarding even began. They knew how to sort through captured prisoners efficiently, separating the valuable ones from those who would not survive the journey to the slave markets. This was their profession, and they were very good at it. The lead raider ship was commanded by a brutal captain named Vrek, a massive Kreth warrior whose body was covered in ritual scars that marked his many successful hunts. He sat in his command chair made of bones and watched the damaged Valorian vessel grow larger on his view screen as his ships closed the distance. His crew worked around him with practiced efficiency, preparing the boarding pods and the restraint devices and the pain implements that would be used to ensure cooperation from the prisoners. Some of his warriors were already arguing about which captives they would claim for themselves before selling the rest. Vrek was pleased with how this hunt had gone. The convoy had been an easy target. The escorts destroyed within moments, and the cargo ship disabled with a single well-placed shot. The Valorians were a weak species, good for labor, but not for fighting. They would fetch decent prices at the markets, especially the younglings, who could be trained and molded into obedient servants. This would be a profitable day for his clan. He gave the order to begin the final approach. His ships accelerated toward the quiet horizon, spreading out into a triangular formation that would allow them to surround the target and prevent any possibility of escape. Not that escape was possible for a ship with dead engines. But Vrek had learned long ago that desperate prey sometimes found unexpected ways to run. It was better to be cautious. On the bridge of the quiet horizon, Captain Zeleth watched the raiders approaching and felt a cold acceptance settle into his bones. He had done everything he could possibly do. He had sent the distress call. He had hidden the younglings in the deepest parts of the ship. He had armed his crew with whatever makeshift weapons they could find. Now, all that remained was to face what was coming with whatever dignity he could maintain. He spoke quietly to his crew, telling them that he was proud of every single one of them. He told them that whatever happened next, they should remember who they were and where they came from. He told them to look after each other in the darkness ahead, because that was all they would have left. The Kreth ships were less than 5 minutes away. When the sensors on the quiet horizon detected something strange, a new set of contacts was emerging from the nebula clouds behind them, moving at incredible speed. Taryn looked up from her station with confusion on her face and reported that 3 unknown vessels were approaching from the opposite direction. She could not identify them through the interference. They were coming fast. Zeleth turned to look at the sensor display, not daring to hope. The new contacts were moving faster than any ships he had ever seen, cutting through the nebula like arrows fired from a bow. They were not Union vessels. The configuration was wrong, the energy signatures unfamiliar. He had never encountered anything like them before. On the lead Kreth raider, one of the sensor operators suddenly shouted a warning to Captain Vrek. New contacts had appeared on their screens. Coming up fast from behind the target vessel, 3 ships of unknown configuration, moving at combat speed with weapon systems. Already charged and ready to fire, Vrek leaned forward in his bone chair and demanded identification. His operator worked frantically at the console and finally reported that the ships appeared to be human in origin. The configuration matched vessels from the human fleet, specifically a carrier and 2 escort frigates. For a moment, Vrek felt genuine confusion. Humans were not supposed to be in this region of space. Humans were a minor species, barely tolerated by the Galactic Union, and certainly not authorized to conduct military operations in Union territory. What were they doing here? Had they gotten lost? Were they on some kind of survey mission that had accidentally brought them into the middle of a raid? He dismissed the concern quickly. Humans were young and inexperienced. Their ships were crude and primitive compared to the elegant vessels of the elder races. 3 human ships against 3 Kreth raiders was an even match at worst. And Vrek had supreme confidence in the fighting ability of his warriors. He gave orders for his ships to ignore the newcomers and continue the approach to the cargo vessel. Once they had secured their prisoners, they could deal with the interfering humans at their leisure. That was a mistake he would not live long enough to regret. USS Resolute emerged from the nebula clouds like a predator, breaking from cover to strike at prey. She was enormous compared to the Kreth raiders, her armored hull gleaming dully in the light of distant stars. Her weapons ports were open and glowing with barely contained energy, ready to unleash devastation at the first command. The smaller frigates flanked her on either side, their own weapons tracking the enemy vessels with deadly precision. Captain Lisa Garrett stood on her bridge and assessed the tactical situation in an instant. 3 enemy ships, 1 damaged friendly vessel, 47 innocent lives hanging in the balance. She had faced worse odds in her career, but not by much. She opened a communication channel and broadcast on all frequencies in a clear and steady voice. She identified herself and her ship and demanded that the Kreth raiders stand down immediately and withdraw from the area. She warned them that any hostile action would be met with overwhelming force. She gave them exactly 10 seconds to comply. On the lead raider, Captain Vrek actually laughed when he heard the transmission. The arrogance of these humans was almost amusing. He opened his own channel and told the human captain that she was interfering in Kreth business and that she should take her little ships and run away before she got hurt. He suggested that perhaps she did not understand who she was dealing with. Garrett's reply was simple. She said that she understood perfectly. Then she gave the order to fire. Commander Ben Harris was the weapons officer aboard the Resolute. A heavy-set man with thick arms and a calm demeanor that masked a talent for destruction that bordered on artistic. When the captain gave the order, he pressed the firing control without hesitation, the Resolute's main railgun fired a solid tungsten projectile at a significant fraction of the speed of light. The round crossed the distance between the ships in less than a second and struck the lead Kreth raider directly amidships. The kinetic energy released was catastrophic. The raider did not explode so much as it simply came apart, the hull shattering into a million pieces that scattered in all directions like confetti thrown at a parade. Captain Vrek and his entire crew were dead before they even realized they were under attack. The second raider tried to run. The captain of that vessel had better survival instincts than his leader and recognized immediately that they were hopelessly outmatched. He ordered full power to engines and attempted to flee back into the cover of the nebula clouds where he might be able to escape. Commander Megan Cole on the Valiant was not about to let that happen. She pushed her frigate to maximum speed and ran down the fleeing raider with the determination of a hunting hound chasing a fox. Her ship was faster and more maneuverable, and she used those advantages ruthlessly. The Valiant's weapons tore into the raider's engines first, crippling its ability to escape, and then systematically destroyed its weapons systems until the vessel was nothing but a drifting hulk. The third raider surrendered. The captain of that ship had watched his leader disintegrate in an instant, and his companion run down and destroyed in less than a minute. He was a pragmatic individual who understood when a fight was unwinnable. He powered down his weapons and shields and broadcast his surrender on all frequencies, begging the humans to spare his ship and crew. Captain Garrett accepted the surrender and ordered the Defiance to take the surviving raider into custody. Captain Henry Walsh moved his frigate into position and trained his weapons on the surrendered vessel. making it very clear that any attempt at treachery would result in immediate destruction. The entire battle had lasted less than 3 minutes from the first shot to the final surrender. 3 Kreth Raider ships had been completely neutralized by the human task force, with no casualties on the human side and minimal damage to any of their vessels. On the bridge of the Quiet Horizon, Captain Zeleth and his crew stared at their view screens in absolute stunned silence. They had watched the entire engagement unfold before their eyes, unable to believe what they were seeing. The ships that had been coming to enslave them were now debris and prisoners. The monsters that had haunted their nightmares for the past hour were gone, and standing between them and any further harm were 3 human warships whose crews had risked everything to save strangers they had never met. Zeleth felt his scales shifting color, moving from the dull gray of fear to a bright blue that signified profound gratitude and wonder. He did not have words for what he was feeling. He was not sure any words existed in his language that could express it properly. Then a voice came over the communication system, calm and professional and somehow wonderfully reassuring. Garrett identified herself and asked if the crew of the Quiet Horizon required medical assistance or other aid. She informed them that the threat had been neutralized and that they were now safe under human protection. Zeleth found his voice at last, told her yes, they needed help, and he thanked her for coming. He thanked her for saving them. Asked her why she had come, why she had risked so much for people she did not know. There was a brief pause before Garrett responded. When she spoke again, her voice carried a warmth that had not been present before. She told him that someone had called for help, and helping was simply what her people did. 14 hours after, the battle in the Andara Nebula. The Galactic Union Patrol Fleet finally arrived at the coordinates where the distress call had originated. They emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation, 12 gleaming warships bearing the insignia of the Union and commanded by officers who represented the finest military traditions of a dozen different elder species. They were prepared for combat, ready to engage the Kreth Raiders and rescue whatever survivors might remain from the attack on the Valorian convoy. What they found instead was something that none of them had expected or were prepared to deal with. Admiral Korith stood on the bridge of his flagship and stared at the scene before him with a mixture of confusion and growing anger. Valorian cargo ship was still there, but it was no longer alone and helpless. 3 human warships were positioned around it in a protective formation, their weapons powered down, but their presence unmistakable. Nearby, the wreckage of 2 Kreth Raiders drifted slowly through space, and a 3rd Raider vessel sat motionless. Under the guns of a human frigate, clearly a captured prize, Korith was a Valeri, species known throughout the galaxy for their rigid adherence to protocol and their deep respect for proper authority. He was tall, even by Valeri standards, with dark purple skin and eyes that glowed with inner light when he was angry. Right now, those eyes were blazing like small suns. He demanded an explanation from his communications officer. He wanted to know who had authorized human ships to operate in Union space. He wanted to know who had given them permission to engage in combat operations. He wanted to know who was responsible for this flagrant violation of interstellar law. His communications officer had no answers to give. The humans had not requested permission because they had not asked for any. They had simply arrived and done what they felt needed to be done. Korith opened a channel to the lead human vessel and demanded to speak with whoever was in command. His voice was cold and formal, the voice of a senior official who was accustomed to being obeyed without question. Captain Lisa Garrett responded to his hail from the bridge of the Resolute. She introduced herself politely and inquired how she might be of assistance to the Admiral. Korith was not interested in pleasantries. He demanded to know by what authority the humans had entered Union territory, engaged hostile forces, and conducted what amounted to a military operation without any authorization from the Galactic Council. He reminded her that humanity was a junior member of the galactic community, barely tolerated and certainly not trusted with the responsibility of independent military action. Garrett remained calm throughout his tirade. When he finished speaking, she transmitted a complete recording of the entire engagement to his flagship. She explained that her crew had intercepted a distress call from a vessel under attack by Kreth raiders. She explained that the nearest Union patrol was 14 hours away and that the crew of the Quiet Horizon did not have 14 hours to wait. She explained that she had made the decision to respond because innocent lives were at stake and she had the ability to save them. She acknowledged that her actions might have violated certain protocols and treaties. She stated that she was fully prepared to accept whatever consequences the Union deemed appropriate for her conduct. But she also pointed out that 47 people were alive right now who would have been dead or enslaved if she had chosen to follow the rules. Instead of following her conscience, Admiral Koreth was not accustomed to being spoken to in such a manner by anyone, let alone by a member of a junior species who had just admitted to breaking interstellar law. He began to formulate a response that would put this arrogant human in her proper place. Before he could speak, however, another transmission came through on the open channel. It was from the Quiet Horizon, and it was addressed to him directly. Captain Zeleth appeared on the view screen, his scales glowing with bright colors that indicated strong emotion. He identified himself formally as the commander of the attacked vessel and a citizen in good standing of the Galactic Union. Then he began to speak about what had happened. He described the attack on his convoy and the destruction of his escort ships. He described the terror that his crew had felt as the Kreth raiders closed in. Knowing that they were about to be taken to a fate worse than death, he described the desperate distress call they had sent out, hoping against hope that someone might hear them in time. And then he described the moment when the human ships had appeared. He spoke of the speed with which they had responded, crossing the nebula in minutes when help should have been hours away. He spoke of the efficiency with which they had destroyed the threat, eliminating 2 raider ships and capturing the third in a battle that lasted less time than it takes to prepare a simple meal. He spoke of the professionalism and compassion that Captain Garrett and her crew had shown in the aftermath, providing medical assistance and emergency supplies without asking for anything in return. He told Admiral Koreth that the humans had saved his life. They had saved the lives of his crew. They had saved 12 younglings who would have been sold into slavery and never seen their families again. They had done this without orders, without authorization, without any guarantee of reward or recognition. He told the Admiral that if this was what the Galactic Union considered a violation of protocol, then perhaps the protocols themselves needed to be reconsidered. The channel fell silent for a long moment after Zeleth finished speaking. On the flagship, Admiral Koreth stood perfectly still as he processed what he had just heard. Around him, his bridge crew watched and waited to see how their commander would respond. Koreth was many things, but he was not a fool. He recognized that this situation had become far more complicated than a simple matter of unauthorized military action. The Valorian captain had just broadcast his testimony on open channels, which meant that every ship in the vicinity had heard it. By now, the recording was probably already spreading across the communication networks of the Nebula region. It would reach major population centers and news organizations. Within days, the entire galaxy would know what had happened here. The humans had broken the rules. But they had broken the rules to save lives, and the people they had saved were now defending them publicly and passionately. If Koreth moved against Captain Garrett now, he would not be seen as an enforcer of interstellar law. He would be seen as a petty bureaucrat, punishing heroes for the crime of being heroic. He made a decision that would have surprised anyone who knew his reputation for rigid adherence to protocol. He transmitted a formal acknowledgement to the Resolute, thanking Captain Garrett and her crew for their assistance in neutralizing a threat to Union shipping. He noted that while certain procedural concerns would need to be addressed through proper diplomatic channels, the immediate priority was the safety and welfare of the survivors from the attacked convoy. It was not an apology, and it was not an endorsement, but it was also not a condemnation. That was more than many observers had expected. Over the following days, the recording of the battle spread across galactic communication networks exactly as Koreth had predicted. Species on dozens of worlds watched the footage of human ships tearing through Kreth raiders with devastating efficiency. They saw the speed of the response and the decisiveness of the engagement. They heard Captain Garrett's calm and professional voice demanding the surrender of the raiders, and they heard her simple explanation for why the humans had come. Someone called for help, and helping was simply what her people did. The reaction across the galaxy was mixed, but predominantly positive. Many species had experienced losses to Kreth raiders over the years. Many had sent distress calls that went unanswered because the Union patrol fleets were too far away or too slow to respond in time. Many had watched helplessly as friends and family were taken to the slave markets now. They saw a species that did not wait for permission. They saw a species that did not calculate the political cost before acting. They saw a species that came running when someone screamed for help. Regardless of who was screaming or where they came from, for the first time since humanity had stumbled onto the galactic stage, other species began to look at them with something other than dismissal or suspicion. They began to look at them with hope. 3 months after the incident in the Andara Nebula, Captain Lisa Garrett received a summons that she had been expecting ever since she gave the order to rescue the Quiet Horizon. She was commanded to appear before the full assembly of the Galactic Council to answer for her actions on that day. The summons was formal and coldly worded, giving no indication of what the outcome might be. She would either be praised as a hero or condemned as a reckless violator of interstellar law. She suspected it would be the latter. The journey to the Council homeworld took several days, during which time Garrett had plenty of opportunity to reflect on her choices. She did not regret what she had done. She would never regret saving those 47 lives, no matter what punishment the Council decided to impose. But she understood that her actions had consequences that extended far beyond her own career. If the Council chose to make an example of her, it could set back human integration into the galactic community by decades. The Council chamber was located in the heart of the most ancient city on the most ancient world in the known galaxy. It was a vast circular arena surrounded by rising tiers of seats that could accommodate representatives from hundreds of different species. The ceiling was a transparent dome that showed the stars themselves, a constant reminder that the decisions made in this room affected the fate of trillions of beings across countless worlds. When Garrett entered the chamber, she found it packed with observers. From every major species in the Union, the seats were filled with diplomats and officials and journalists who had come to witness what everyone expected to be a significant moment in galactic history. The air hummed with the sound of translation devices working to convert the murmurs and whispers of dozens of different languages into something comprehensible at the center of the chamber floor. A single platform had been prepared for the person being summoned to speak. Garrett walked to that platform alone, her footsteps echoing in the sudden silence that fell over the assembly. She wore her dress uniform, freshly pressed and decorated with the medals she had earned over 20 years of service. She held her head high and kept her expression calm and professional. The chief counselor, an ancient being whose species had been traveling between stars when humanity's ancestors were still learning to control fire, called the assembly to order. He recited the formal charges against Captain Garrett: unauthorized entry into Union space, engagement in combat operations without proper authorization, and potential violation of treaties governing the conduct of junior member species. Then he asked if she had anything to say in her defense before the council rendered its judgment. Garrett looked around the chamber at the hundreds of faces watching her from the tiered seats. Some of those faces showed hostility. Others showed curiosity. A few showed something that might have been sympathy or even admiration. She took a deep breath and began to speak. She did not offer excuses or attempt to minimize what she had done. She acknowledged that she had entered Union space without permission. She acknowledged that she had engaged in combat without authorization. She acknowledged that her actions had created diplomatic complications that would take time and effort to resolve. But then she asked the council a question. She asked them what they would have done in her position. She asked them to imagine receiving a distress call from a ship full of families and children, knowing that help was needed in minutes, but official rescue was hours away. She asked them to imagine having the power to save those lives and choosing not to use it because the paperwork had not been properly filed. She told them that where she came from, There was a word for people who stood by and did nothing while innocents suffered. She told them that word was not something any decent person wanted to be called. She told them that she had made her choice in that moment. She would make the same choice again without hesitation. She told them that if they wanted to punish her for saving lives, that was their right under galactic law. But she would not apologize for what she had done, because she was not sorry. The chamber fell completely silent when she finished speaking. No one moved or whispered, or even seemed to breathe. The chief counselor looked down at her from his elevated position with an expression that she could not read. Then, from somewhere in the upper tiers, someone began to applaud. It was a single pair of hands at first, clapping slowly in the silence. Then another pair joined in, and another, and another. Within moments, the applause had spread across entire sections of the chamber. Representatives from dozens of species were rising from their seats to show their approval, their various appendages creating a cacophony of sound that filled the ancient hall. Not everyone applauded. Some sat in stony silence, their expressions disapproving or angry, but they were in the minority, and their silence was drowned out by the noise of those who had chosen to stand. The chief counselor raised a hand and gradually restored order to the chamber. When silence had returned, he looked down at Captain Garrett. With eyes that had seen civilizations rise and fall over the course of millennia, he told her that the council had reviewed the evidence extensively. He told her that the testimony of Captain Zeleth and the crew of the Quiet Horizon had been entered into the official record. He told her that the council had also received communications from numerous other worlds expressing opinions about the incident. He told her that the council had reached a decision. Garrett braced herself for whatever was coming. The chief counselor announced that the charges against Captain Garrett were being formally dismissed. He stated that, while her actions had violated the letter of certain protocols, they had upheld the spirit of everything the Galactic Union was supposed to represent. The Union existed to protect and nurture the civilizations within its borders. When that protection failed, as it had failed the Quiet Horizon, someone else had stepped forward to fill the gap. Then he announced something that Garrett had not expected at all. He stated that the council had voted to extend a formal invitation to humanity. The humans were being asked to establish a permanent rapid response force along the frontier regions, specifically tasked with answering emergency distress calls when official Union patrols could not respond quickly enough. This force would operate with council authorization and would be integrated into the broader Union command structure. In other words, the very action that had brought Garrett before the council in disgrace was now being made official policy. The humans would become the ones who answered when no one else could arrive in time. The announcement triggered another wave of applause from the assembly, louder and more sustained than before. Garrett stood on her platform and felt something she had not allowed herself to feel since the battle: genuine hope. When the session finally concluded and the representatives began to file out of the chamber, Garrett found herself approached by Captain Zeleth. The Valorian had made the long journey to the council homeworld specifically to be present for this moment. His scales glowed with warm colors as he extended a greeting in the human fashion. Offering his hand for her to shake, he told her that he had never stopped believing that the council would make the right decision. He told her that his people and many others had sent messages supporting the humans and demanding that Garrett be recognized rather than punished. He told her that across the galaxy, species who had lived in fear of raiders and pirates were celebrating the news that someone would finally come when they called for help. Garrett shook his hand and thanked him for everything he had done. She told him that she was just glad his crew was safe. Zeleth smiled in the way his species expressed that emotion. He told her that his crew was more than safe. They were alive and free and grateful beyond words. He told her that his younglings would grow up knowing that there were people in the galaxy who would risk everything to protect strangers. He told her that was the greatest gift anyone could give as Garrett left the council chamber and stepped out into the light of an alien sun. She reflected on how strange the galaxy could be. She had come here expecting punishment and had instead been handed an opportunity that exceeded anything humanity had achieved since first contact. They had been dismissed as newcomers and amateurs. Now, they were being asked to serve. As the first responders for the entire frontier, somewhere out there in the darkness between stars, another ship would send a distress call. Another crew would wait in fear and pray for rescue. And when that happened, the humans would answer. Because that was simply what they did.